What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Shadow Owner here, back with another Assetto Corsa video. Today's video we're gonna go over drift tuning. I've been doing a lot of iRacing lately, so I kind of wanted to come back to my sim drifting, sim racing roots. Pretty much a majority of my sim driving experience is all drifting. I have like 900 hours or so, 900 hours on Assetto, and a good 85-90% of that is all drifting. So let's get started here. One of the things to think about in drifting, though, for Assetto mods is not all mods are going to allow you to adjust everything. For example, a solid axle car, they won't allow you to adjust your alignment on the rear axle. You'll be able to adjust your ride height or your spring rate if the mod allows you to in your setup. But even if it has available alignment settings in the back, you're not really going to be able to change anything back there. It won't affect how the car drives. But we're focusing on this 240. This is a mod I put together. This is my own. It's got my own custom stuff on it. I custom modeled that 326 wing. I made the headlights and the tail lights and the corner marker lights, and I did the livery on it. And I did a lot of the data work on it. So this is kind of my own custom private mod, but I'm going to be using this to kind of walk through a lot of the tuning stuff, because this car has full tuning adjustability. It has the ability to tune pretty much everything. Full damper tuning, spring rate tuning, ride height tuning, adjustable anti-roll bars, alignment, front and rear. So we got all the stuff that you need to really dial in a car. It's also got my special tire compound on it that I like for extra grippy boy stuff. So let's start talking about what we got going on here. So here's what the kind of I did a lot of this in VR, so if it's a little iffy for some of y'all, I'm sorry, but I'll try to pause it and make some screenshots so that way you can kind of see what I got going on here. So right now we're looking at the main setup screen. So one thing to keep in mind is that you see the car status thing over on the right hand side here, where it has, you know, a readout for camber. My yellow dot's over that right now. One thing to keep in mind is whatever your tuning options say over there on the left hand side, those don't matter. Only thing that really matters is what your car readout status says. So you'll see once I get going to the alignment here. Alright, so this car has two different tire options I set up. One of them is my street compound, and one of them is my sticky compound that are kind of based around semi-slicks with a bit more hooked upness going on for a forward bite. I really like to have my cars have a lot of forward bite, so I kind of created my own special tire compound on top of allowing some tuning ability in there. So one of the first things you might want to do when you're setting up your drift car is you might want to drop the tire pressure if you're looking for some grip, or if you're on a lower horsepower car, you might want to actually increase your tire pressure. This is one of the few ones that you can kind of trust, but just remember that your tire pressure settings are cold. So if you have tire blankets on or anything like that, when you go actually load in to drive, then you take a look at your tire pressure monitor app. It may say something different than what you have cold, so you just got to pay attention if it's hot, if your tires have tire blankets, or if they get warm, because that will change. But this is how you set your cold pressure right there. If the tires are set up correctly, like I said, I made my own tire compounds, so other people can make their own tire compounds. So if you're running, it depends on the mod and how their tires are set up, but most of the time a good rule of thumb is that if you want a little bit more grip, try dropping the tire pressure a little bit. Maybe do it a couple PSI at a time. You know, you don't want to take 20 PSI out right away if you don't know what it's going to do. So maybe drop it 10 PSI, 5 PSI, see how it feels. If it feels hooked up, maybe keep going. If it doesn't get you quite where you want, try to take out a little bit more. But then again, if you go too low, it can also do some weird sloppy stuff to how the car handles. So we're going to take a look at the alignment now. So again, kind of like what I said, the left hand side here where you're actually adjusting versus your right hand side, they say two different things on this car. Some cars they'll say exactly the same, and some cars they will be quite a bit far off. It also depends on your ride height settings and how the spring's loaded up in the car, how much weight. because you can set your ride height a certain level, and the car might be a certain amount of weight, and the springs are going to compress a bit once the car's loaded in under weight, under load. So it could have a different setting from however it's all set up in the suspension. So that's the thing to watch out, is that your toe, your alignment, all the numbers on the left-hand side may not exactly be what the car's reading. So always go by the car status bar on the left. So some of the things to think about when you're at full lock, and you might feel a lot of understeer or something like that, maybe try adding a bit more negative camber. One of the things that we've kind of noticed is that the more negative camber you have, the more responsive the car is at lock, versus when it doesn't have as much negative camber. It'll probably be more responsive towards like center or no steering angle. The higher your steering angle is, the more negative camber you're going to want to be. This car has about 90, or not 90, I'm sorry, that's a lie. This car has about 60 degrees of steering angle. I think it's like 58 lead, 46 follow. That is, when you turn all the way to the right, your right tire is going to be 58, and your left tire is going to be 46. That little difference there is kind of called your Ackerman angle, and that allows you to navigate around corners. But we won't get too much into that. So again, we're kind of circling here. Follow my yellow dot. I'm going over your camber there. I'm telling you that the camber on my car is a little bit different than what it reads out to be. So right now what I'm doing is I'm pulling up my suspensions app, my suspension, where it's in under your dev app, so you might have to turn those on in your settings. But right here you can see we got camber, we got toe, and if, like I said, if I turn that all the way over, you can see, look at that, about 58 degrees, and you can see over there on the left hand side, or on the left hand side of the screen, you can see the 46 there for the toe. So that just tells you how much steering angle you got, how much steering input you have. And then this last number is your steer ratio. That's not something you really need to worry about. That's really more for people who make mods. And then we got your caster and your kingpin inclination and your scrub radius. That stuff you can't really change up in the setup menu. But again, that's more for stuff for people who actually are working on suspension development. But what we're going to kind of focus on right now is the rear. We got, again, the rear suspension there. We got camber and toe. Again, we don't really have rear steering, so we're not going to worry about that. But one thing to watch out for is suspension geometry. Again, this kind of goes back to mods not exactly all being made the same. Some suspension geometry is going to have a lot of camber gain or a lot of toe gain. So you got to watch out for how your suspension reacts. So pull up your suspension app and then maybe try doing a launch or two. So when you get your ride height set, when you get your spring rate set, go do a couple test launches with your suspension app. Watch your camber gain, watch your toe gain, and that will help you dial in your alignment settings for how much grip you want. So we're gonna, again, keep your eye on that camber number, or the C. The C is camber, the T is your toe. And alright, so I go for a launch there, and it gains a little bit of negative camber there, about 0.2 negative camber gain. I think there's something wrong with the suspension on this car. I got to go back and revisit it, because it looks like maybe the toe has a bit of a, gets a little bit of a negative, a little bit of a toe out action under compression. So I'm going to have to go look at my steer geometry there on the rear. But again, so now we're taking a look here. We got your camber there that we're looking at. So now it's something to keep in mind now is that when this car goes for a squat, it's going to gain about 0.2 negative camber. So we can keep that pretty much 0 and be A-okay, not have to worry about anything. When you are looking for the rear, if you're trying to get more grip, it's better to have your camber zeroed out to keep that tire flat on the ground. But if you have something with a lower horsepower, you might want to actually increase your camber a little bit. Help get the tires to slip up a little bit, not have as much grip. It all depends on personal preference, and again, if you're really going for that stancy hot boy style, you'll already have a bunch of camber dialed in, and you'll want to start looking at other ways to make the car grip up. But again, the hot boy style, that's an entirely different thing. We're trying to get some grip out of this car, which it's already pretty gripped up from my standard settings, just because that's how I like my cars to be. So if you're looking for grip, zero out your camber. Again, check your camber curve, see what the car does when it starts getting loaded up. Now that will change if you soften your springs here, because the softer they are, the more it's going to compress and the more of the suspension geometry range you're going to do. Right here I dropped the rear suspension all the way down, and again you can see just what I'm talking about. I dropped my ride height all the way down, and it actually added a bit more negative camber. It looks like it gained about a half a degree, 0.3 degrees of negative camber once I dropped all the ride height out of it. Put it back up to normal. One thing you can do is you can set a quick pit button. You can have one that sets you right into the pits here in the setup menu, where you get your pause menu back up here where we can go adjust things, and you have another one where you just teleports you back to pits, but it doesn't actually bring you into the pit menu. So when you're doing something like this, be mindful. It's good to have that non-menu setup button set up, so that way you can hit that button once you make some changes, have the car reset itself, have it pull back into where you have to check for the geometry. So again, we changed some settings in the back. Now we're just checking how the camber gain goes with a little bit softer spring rate. So again, your softer springs are going to have more of your suspension curve, more suspension travel in them, so you'll probably get more camber gain or toe gain depending on the geometry. Some geometry will be better than others. One thing I like to do is I like to pull out my rear sway bar all the way. The softer your rear sway bar is, the more likely you are to get gripped up. And as you can see me by tilting my head back and forth, what I'm kind of letting myself know here is that the car will be a little bit more wobbly. The car will roll a bit more when you're driving around, sliding around, so it allows that suspension to move a bit freely and kind of soak up bumps as it needs to. I tend to pull out my rear sway bar all the way. Again, if you have a lower horsepower car where you're struggling to drift it, and maybe you have some really grippy tires on it and you just can't keep it sliding, it's a good thing to try to maybe add a bit more rear sway bar. What that will do is it'll stiffen it up in the back. It won't allow the rear end to be super soft. It won't allow it to roll around as much. It'll help you keep the car sliding, get the car sliding, add a bit more oversteer to it. Another thing you can do is you can kind of add a bit more spring rate up front, and what that will do is that'll stiffen it up a little bit, make it understeer a little bit more, keep the front end planted. Or you can take away a bit of spring rate, and that will again soften up the front end, allow it to float around a bit more. You might get a little bit more steering response, or a little bit less steering response, but have a bit more steering grip up front. It's all personal preference. I tend to actually run a bit stiffer front sway bar than normal people. Some people like to take the front sway bar all the way out up front, or bring it down as soft as you can. But again, once you make any ride height settings, again, changing your spring rate will adjust your ride height as well. It's just how Assetto works. It works the same way as real life. Changing your spring rate, changing your ride height, that will change what your alignment settings are. So if you're driving around, you like your alignment how it is, but hey, you pull out a little bit of spring rate, you drop it down a little bit, increase the ride height a little bit, you might want to go check your alignment settings just to make sure. I pull a little bit out here, but again, I didn't really have any major enough that I really needed to go revisit my alignment. I wasn't really too worried about how it was sitting. So now when it comes to toe, my toe settings, I like to have a 0.2 up front, no more than really that. Here I'm adjusting my sway bar up front. What this will do is it will kind of make the car understeer a bit more, kind of make you rely on the rear tires. So you'll have to drive it a bit more and be a bit more cautious. You're not going to be able to flick it in super hard because it'll probably understeer, but it keeps that front end stable while you're drifting. And if you really like people who three-wheel, a stiff front sway bar might help with that. Keep the suspension all tight up front. One thing I like to do sometimes is I actually will increase the front ride height. If you increase your front ride height, what that'll do is that'll kind of preload some weight on the rear. You can kind of see I have a 15 mil stagger, it looks like, front to rear. So what this will do is this will automatically shift your weight balance a bit more rearward. It will make the car a little bit more snappy, again, because you're putting more weight on the rear axle. But it's something to do if you're really trying to look for some grip. Try maybe raising the front end up a little bit, shift that weight rearward, putting over the rear tires to help it really put the power down and get some traction. But again, because you raised the front ride height, you got to check your alignment settings. It didn't go too crazy with this one, so I'm not too worried about how it changed. So a little recap, what I like to change. So toe in, toe out. I don't know what Assetto uses for its toe values, but I like to keep no more than a negative 0.3 up front. That's a bit on the extreme side. I tend to hover around 0.25, 0.2 toe out, so negative for toe out. For toe in, it's positive. You'll want the rear to have positive toe, so that when it squats down, it kind of forces tires into each other. Then it'll help give you some forward bite. Again, you don't want to go too extreme. 0.2 is usually more than enough. But again, positive in the rear, negative out front. The negative toe will kind of help give you a little bit of stability, especially when you start getting towards full lock. Your spring rate, a softer spring rate in the rear will help the car squat and get the weight over the rear end. It'll allow the car to kind of tuck up a little bit. So a softer rear spring will help give you some traction. But again, if you're in a lower horsepower car and you're really fighting it, it might have a bit of body roll. Maybe try adding a bit more spring rate in the rear to keep the car stiff and not really allow the suspension to soak up the movements and kind of transfer it all into the tire. Ride height a little bit, kind of like the same thing as raising the front to shift the weight to the back. You can kind of drop the rear ride height a little bit if you want to, or you can kind of increase the rear ride height if you want to get it a bit less squatty. But that's really more for stance and style. I tend to put the rear ride height right where I want for my fitment, and then I'll adjust the front if I want more rear bite, or I'll adjust the spring rate if I want more rear bite. The anti-roll bars, they will help you, a softer rear anti-roll bar will give you some free movement in the back, let the rear suspension move around, float around, soak up the bump, soak up the travel. So a soft rear bar will give you more grip. Again, if you're in a lower horsepower car and you're trying to get it to slide more, maybe try increasing the rear sway bar a little bit. You don't want to go too crazy with it, but a little bit here and there. Increase it a little bit by little bit and see if you can get it how you want to feel. Stiffer front spring will again try to keep more weight back, push towards the back, push towards on the rear of the car. But you got to be careful because going over bumps, too stiff of a front spring will cause you to lose front traction, and you might understeer and not have a good time. Same with too stiff of a front bar. If you put too stiff of a front anti-roll bar in, it will make you understeer quite a bit, and you might have a hard time doing some really nice flick entries, Scandinavian flicks, weight transfer entries, however you want to call it. When you flick from one side to the other side just to try to weight transfer the car into a drift, the stiffer your front bar is, the more likely you are to understeer doing that type of technique. So toe in for more grip in the rear, or you can zero it out depending on what you're trying to go for. But I like to toe in a little bit. Your camber, you want to keep that zeroed out for more grip. And again, you're going to want to check how your camber curve is when you're under load. So pull up your suspensions app, do a quick test launch, see if that camber gain is a lot or a little. The more travel you have in your suspension, the more likely you're going to have quite a bit of camber gain. So if we look at something like DCGP cars, they'll have quite a bit of positive toe in them already because they're pretty loose or pretty soft, and they have quite a bit of ride height in them. So when you go to get on the gas and get some load in the rear end, it will squat down on you and allow you to that positive camber will keep that tire flat on the ground once it gets squatted in, and it goes through your suspension curve. To kind of recap the front alignment a little bit, so again, toe out up front will keep you a bit more stable. I wouldn't really do any toe in for your drift cars, there's no point, but a little bit of toe out will help keep you a little bit more stable in drift. a little bit more negative camber. The more steering angle you have, the more negative camber you're going to want. The more negative camber will help you towards lock. The less negative camber you have, the more gripped up it will be towards center or zero steering. So if you have a car that really pushes when you're trying to do a flick from driving straight, maybe try to take away some of that negative camber. But at the same time, you'll want to check and make sure that you don't have like 90 degrees of steering, because then you might get some wonky feel at full lock because you won't have enough camber to keep the tires flat when you're at full lock. So it's kind of a give and take, personal preference, personal feel. A little bit of camber never hurts, but too much camber can, and too little camber can. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the comment section below. I'll try to answer as many. If there is a lot of questions about a particular topic, I may make another video. Now, I'm not exactly the most knowledgeable person in the world when it comes to suspension tuning or suspension setup. This is just all the stuff I've kind of figured out myself by playing around and flirting with my own tunes here. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'll try to answer them the best I can, and hopefully I can catch y'all sliding. I do have a server up. I tend to use the DWG cars because those are my current favorite besides my own cars. My own cars are not public, so nobody can get them and nobody can slide with me. So I have the DWG cars up on the SRG, or the Shadow Realm Garage server. I believe it's currently set up for toge drifting. 9 times out of 10 I'll have it on a toge from like 90s GDSP. Usually I'll have the links in the description too, so if you want to see, maybe catch a slide with me, look for my server and hop around. I'll also have links into my Discord in the comments or the description below, and there are also links in the description of my server on Assetto. So look forward to catching y'all sliding. Hope this helped you out. I'll catch y'all in the next video.